My name is Antonia. I'm the chair for the Education Committee here at the Barron Arts Center. Along with our commissioners, I see like a couple of them here tonight. And we have a continuation on the series of the Impressionists. So tonight's lecture will be on Monet, and in September and October, I believe, we'll be having Degas and Renoir. So a lot of you are hopefully coming back. Just a little bit of history here. The Taste of the Arts lecture series was founded for one of our commissioners years ago. So I know that a lot of you have come year after year, and if you have any ideas, please let me know. Come up to me if there's something that you would like to see. I entertain all ideas, and I'd like to see that the house is full as it is tonight. One item of business is if you can turn off your phones. I would appreciate that so that the lecture is not interrupted. And everyone, if you've not been here before, Marianne Salata, our lecturer tonight, is a professor at Holyrood, which is the Rutgers University Older Adults Program Outreach. So you can actually sign up for classes for her, and she teaches many other things besides Impressionism. She also has been lecturing on cruise ships as well, so perhaps if you go on a cruise, you may see her doing a lecture or two. She has a lot of education behind her. She has her BA in Art History from Drew University and her Master's from Rutgers University. So without further ado, I introduce to you Marianne Salata on her lecture on Monet.
Thank you. It's so very nice to be back again, and I want to thank Antonia for having me back. Today we are really going to get into the Impressionists. Remember on our first lecture we talked about Paris and the Paris of the 19th century and how it became a modern city. And 3 weeks ago we talked about Manet. Now Manet was really a leader of the realist group and was a friend of the Impressionists, but as I told you, he never really became an Impressionist because first of all, he liked using a lot of black in his pictures. All of his pictures were studio pictures, the majority, and I'd say 98% of them were studio pictures done in the studio. He never really worked in plein air, except perhaps the portrait that he did of Monet and his wife in the garden. Toward the end of his life, when his health was going, he spent his summers in the suburbs. The family had a little cottage there, and he did do a few paintings in the garden. But outside of that, he was primarily a studio artist. And he always wanted to be accepted by the Salon in France. That's the reason why he would never exhibit with the Impressionists, even though every time they had something like 8 Impressionist exhibitions, one every 2 years, and he never would show with them. So anyway, without further ado, let me begin talking a little bit about Monet. Now, the French Impressionists of the 19th century were the first artists who could truly be called modern, but in subject matter and also in execution. They turned from traditional subject matter, such as religious and mythological subjects, and evolved a new way of seeing. That was important, a new way of seeing and portraying their subjects. They were the first generation of urban artists who portrayed the city and la vie moderne, including people at work and people at play. The urban landscape, whether it be the park, the new streets laid out by Baron Haussmann, or the new railroad terminals, were all subjects they eagerly embraced. Add to this their new way of visualizing these subjects, and you have a dynamic new art that speaks to us today even better than it spoke to those of the 19th century. And so let's find out a little bit now about Monet's life. By the way, he was the last of the original Impressionist artists to die. And he died in 1926, and he and Mary Cassatt, the American Impressionists who went to France and worked with the Impressionists, they were the last two of the original core group of Impressionists to die. So the movement, which began in the 1860s, went on for more than 40 years, more than 50 years of time. And next year we will celebrate also the 100th anniversary of the death of Renoir. And by the way, right now there is an exhibition. Is anyone going to London shortly? Oh yes, all right. There is an exhibition until July 29th of, and maybe you know about it, Monet and architecture. Do you know about this exhibition?
Where
Yes.
is it being held?
Yeah,
Where is it being held?
sorry?
Where is it being held?
It's going to be held, it's going to be at the National Gallery in London. And the show is on right now. I didn't even know about it until I saw it in the Wall Street Journal. They had a review of it. And so anyway, you'll be ready for seeing something like that. Okay. Here is a portrait of Monet by a friend of his, Cézanne. We don't know, he was an artist, but certainly nowhere near as famous as Monet was to become. He was born on November 14th in 1840 to a very prosperous family of grocers and ship's chandlers. He was cocksure and rebellious and constantly living the high life, which was to lead him into considerable debt. At one point, as a matter of fact, he owed a bill to a laundress, and it took him 10 years to pay her. Poor woman, a laundress of all things. I mean, they were really the lowest rung of labor in France at the time, and it was really appalling when I read that. His artistic talents emerged very early in his life. By the age of 15, he was selling caricatures for 15 to 20 francs apiece. Now, at that time, a dentist could charge 1 franc to remove a tooth, but he was earning between 15 to 20 francs for his caricatures, and I will show you 2 of them shortly. He once said that he would have been a millionaire if he'd stayed with caricatures. Now, by the age of 16, he was a student of Eugène Boudin, a Honfleur artist, and by the way, he was born in Honfleur, so he was still living at home at the age of 16. And Boudin was a Honfleur artist who had seen his drawings, and at first, Monet did not like his plein air style of painting. In other words, Boudin would go out to the beach, set up his easel, get out his canvas, and paint away. Now, it was still traditional for an artist, even a landscape artist, to go out, do the sketching, bring it back to your studio, look at your sketches, decide which one was the best, and that's the one you would paint. Or maybe you might combine 2 sketches together to make one painting. But the work was all done in the studio. And at first, Monet thought this whole thing was a little bit eccentric, perhaps. But he was soon won over to this style of painting. Now, when he was 19 or 18 or 19, went in 1859 anyway, he was a student went to Paris, and he was a student at the Atelier Suisse, which was a studio where it was really kind of a loosely kind of run business. If you came in, you'd pay a small fee, and there would be a model there, and you could sketch and draw and whatnot. Now, his father wanted him to go to the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the premier training, shall we say, training camp or training school for artists who wanted to be accepted by the Salon. But Monet, being the rebellious one he was, didn't want to do it. So his father cut off his allowance. And this was a pattern that went on for many, many years. When Monet did something his father didn't like, he cut off his allowance and said he had to go begging to all his friends, or maybe camp out with his friends, okay, because he had no money. Now, by 1862, he's studying at the studio of Monsieur Glaire, where he met Renoir, Frederic Bastille, and Alfred Sisley. They were all studying there at the same time, and they all were impressionists or became impressionists, okay, and they really were the cadre of the forefront movement. They had not yet met Degas. They met Degas a few years later because Degas was introduced. Degas met Pissarro, and Pissarro introduced Degas. So they all got together. All right. Now, Frederic Bastille, was one of the impressionists. Unfortunately, he was from a very wealthy family, and he was always loaning money to Renoir and Monet as well. Unfortunately, Basile was to die in the Franco-Prussian War at the age of 29. His father went out with a cart and searched for 2 weeks to find his body so he could bury it. Very sad situation. And he just was, it was just picking up his speed at that time. So there's very, very few works by Basile, unfortunately. Now, Sisley himself was from an English-French family of merchants who had come to Paris to learn the trade, but instead devoted his time to art and was basically hooked on art. Now, in 1864, he meets Camille Dancieux, and they begin a relationship of which his family did not approve. So again, they cut off his allowance. He and Camille moved from place to place, leaving many unpaid bills behind them, even sneaking out of a hotel early in the morning so that they could get away without having to pay. Now, Paul Durand-Ruel, who was a Paris art dealer, tried to sell Monet's works and those of other Impressionists. He constantly advanced money not only to him but to the other Impressionists as well. In 1865, here's another one. Now I'm showing you another portrait of Monet, this one done by Renoir. Monet and Renoir were to forge a very strong, not only a strong friendship, but also a strong working relationship, which I'm going to discuss in a little while, in a few minutes. Now and they did portraits of each other. I mean, it was, first of all, if you had to use a model, you'd have to pay the model. Mm-hmm. But if you used, I'll paint you and then you'll paint me kind of thing, it was reciprocal, and of course it didn't cost any money. So this is Renoir's picture, painting of Claude Monet. Now, financial problems arose, as I said, and they were constantly in need of money. But in 1865, wait a minute now. Oh, all right. In 1865, however, 2 of his seascapes were accepted at the Salon, and his name was confused with Manet, who thought that this upstart was trying to capitalize on his name. Until he met him, he was introduced to him, and then their names just happened to be so very close to each other. It's easy to remember. Manet was the older of the two, because Monet wasn't born until 1840. Manet was born in 1832, and A comes before O, so that's the best way to remember it, okay? Now, Camille in 1867 had a son, Jean, but they did not marry until 1870. Now, and another son, Michel, was born in 1878. I'm sorry, 1879, I got that wrong. No, 1878, she died in, 1878, that's correct. After the Franco-Prussian War, Monet fled to London, and they settled eventually at Verteuil, outside of Paris, which was a very prolific period for him. Now, during the Franco-Prussian War, Renoir, Manet, they were considered. Well, Manet was considered a citizen soldier. In other words, he had a uniform and would have to go and fight if his battalion was called up. Renoir also was drafted. And I will discuss in a few months what happened to him. But he was drafted into the war as well, and Frederick Basile, and some of the others, however, fled Paris, and Monet was one of them. Now, let me see here. In 1875. In 1875, Monet got a commission to paint large-scale works for the walls of the Chateau Rothenburg. Ernest Hocheday was a very wealthy Parisian merchant, a textile merchant, and his wife Alice was an heiress. And Hocheday had inherited the business, and despite their opulent lifestyle, which Monet envied, he always envied somebody that had more money than he did. Mm-hmm. He was always counting OPM, other people's money. Okay? So he was always very, very jealous of anybody that had a dime more than he did, which most people did have a dime more than he did. He was so poor. Okay. The Hochedais were basically going bankrupt, and they were living on Alice's inheritance of about 200,000 gold francs and the chateau, all right? So in the summer of 1876, Monet is back at the chateau, while Ernest leaves to try to sort out his finances, leaving Alice alone with Monet. Now, by November, Monet is very, very worried about Camille's health, but he still remains at the chateau. And in 1877, Ernest fled to Belgium to avoid his creditors and Alice's wrath, because she was really at her wit's end with him. Now, but at this time, Alice is pregnant. Monet may have been the father, but he never acknowledged the boy. The boy's name is Jean-Pierre, but he was never acknowledged as the father. By 1877, the Hochedets lose everything: chateau, furniture, art collection, all down to under the bang of the gavel, in order to pay the debts. Alice flees to Biarritz, and she gives birth on the train going down to Biarritz because her husband's creditors were after her now. Okay, in March of 1878, now here's what happened. In 1878, Monet decide to move to Vitheuil with the Hochedet family, and he's going to support them all. Now, he can't support his wife and his baby, but he's going to support Ernest and Alice and their 4 children and the other suddenly he has become the breadwinner for something like 9 people. So he really wasn't, it was a little bit financially not too astute, shall we say, okay? Now, by this time, in March of 1878, Camille gives birth to her 2nd son, but she is ill with a cervical ulcer that may be cancerous. Monet finds, as I said, the cheaper house in Vitheuil, and Alice, her 6 children, and Ernest, it was 12 people all together with 1 or 2 servants to take care of them. And he's going to support all these people. Totally impossible. Now, by 1879, Alice and her daughters nurse Camille, who was now dangerously ill. Monet begs for more money from all of his friends. And finally, even that dries up because he cried wolf once too often. He wrote a letter to someone saying, please, may you lend me some money? My wife is very ill. And the man wrote back, just make sure you give her some nice fresh milk. It didn't realize that this woman was basically dying. Now, he is very depressed, and he takes it out on Ernest. He manages to sell some of his works, but it's nowhere near enough to keep the household from running into debt. This unusual ménage continued until 1881. In September 5th of 1879, Camille dies at age 32, leaving Monet and 2 sons, one a baby of 18 months. Now, in 1873, he moves to his final home in Giverny, which is outside the village of Vernon in Normandy. And Vernon is a lovely village. It really is. It's very charming. And there he spends the rest of his life painting and renovating the gardens. And when I say renovating, I mean there was a stream. He managed to dig a ditch and made a pond. And I mean, he by this time, of course, by the 1890s and whatnot, he had money, and he was employing 5 or 6 people, gardeners, to come in and dig up the whole situation and completely renovate the property. As a matter of fact, if he had not succeeded as an artist, he would have made a wonderful architectural designer of gardens, a wonderful garden designer, very, very much like the people who did the New York Central Park. I was going to mention something else on this now. Okay. Monet dies in 1926, very famous and respected, the country gentleman he always wanted to be. He and Marie Cassatt both die on the same year, 1926, and as I mentioned, they were the last of the original group of Impressionists who exhibited with each other. Yeah. I'm going to show you, first of all, 2 works by his teacher, Boudin. This is called The Beach at Villerville from 1864. Now, Boudin was born in Normandy and spent his life doing marine scenes of urban middle-class people enjoying themselves. He was very, very influential upon Monet and thus on all the Impressionists because of his insistence in working on plein air, or meaning outside. Monet was the pupil of Boudin for just 6 months, but Boudin managed to persuade Monet that this was the way to go. All right? Now, Boudin's subject matter and working methods were to influence Monet. And it's an interesting treatment of sky and the waning light. But what do we have here? Well, first of all, we have a group of obviously urban middle-class Parisians who have come out to the beach for, let's say, for the weekend or for a Sunday afternoon stroll. And notice, we can tell that they're from Paris because they're wearing the most fashionable clothes. And the men are wearing top hats, okay? And there is also a dog who has wandered in. Oops, sorry. There is also a dog which has wandered in, was wandering around, okay? But there they are with their parasols and whatnot in the waning light. It certainly looks as if it's perhaps early evening, around 6:30, when the sun is setting. And look at it, and here's another one now. Boudin's concert at the Casino of Deauville in 1865. Again, these casinos were set up, and they had music on the beach. So naturally, people would gather around for the music, and as you can see, it is an urban crowd. It is not the local peasants who would be wearing clothes that look different than these people. In those days, clothes, and I always emphasize this, clothes are so important in paintings. Why are they important? First of all, they give away not only the person's social class, but other elements of the person's character as well. Secondly, they give a little bit, well, besides the social class, it also tells you a little bit about the person, and it tells you to which group that person belongs. Today, denim is ubiquitous. Everybody wears denim. But in those days, you would set off who you were by what you wore. For example, you would never go out. A man or a woman would never leave the house without a pair of gloves. And gloves, as a matter of fact, are one of the prime, shall we say, requisites of, at that time, being a lady or a gentleman. Gloves were so important that in one case, in many cases, they were given as betrothal gifts. Gloves, yes, gloves. Embroidered gloves were given as betrothal gifts. A man would give that to his fiancée. And they were very, very important examples of social status. And this is the way you set yourself apart from somebody who was of lesser status than you are. We don't think of gloves as being status today. I mean, you wear it when you're in the garden or having to wash dishes, but we don't think of them as having any kind of status. But 150 years ago, they had a lot of status. Now, so here again, you see this urban crowd, and look at the way that and the background, how the trees in the background kind of fall off so beautifully, and actually frame the group. They are in front of all that greenery, and they are framed by the greenery. Now, I told you I was going to show you caricatures that Monet did, and the first one on the left is of Jules Champfleury. He was a French realist novelist and art critic, and he defended Courbet's realism and was the author of A History of Caricature. And he was also a critic that defended the Impressionists. So there is Champfleury, and he obviously must have had a very long nose and a big chin, because he's really mocking him. Just wonderful. It looks like a David Levine that would be in David Levine caricature that would be in the New Yorker magazine. And on the right is a caricature of a man named Charles Didier, who was a novelist at the time, now mainly forgotten. But he has painted, he has made a caricature of him as a bee, perhaps because he was very, very stinging in his sarcasm or whatever. And notice that that he has been caught by the dog who is holding a string down there, okay, or a dog or a horse that is holding the string to keep him from flying away. So we can see that he was extremely talented even with caricature. And I'm going to show you another caricature that I know I showed you with the first lecture. Remember, we talked about the work of Nadar. Nadar was doing the photography in Paris after the the lithographs that that were done by Daguerre, the daguerreotypes that he had done. The method didn't last very long because, as you know, it would involve mercury vapors and it was very toxic. So it only lasted about 10 years, but by that time we had photography, and Nadar was the premier photographer in Paris. But not only that, he also, as I told you, took the balloon ride over Paris and was taking pictures. And so it was really the first aerial views of any city in the world. Now I'm going to show you his Parisian scenes. This first one is the Quai du Louvre. Now this was done from the second floor balcony of the Louvre. In other words, you can still go to the Louvre if you're an artist, make an arrangement, and you can go there and they will give you permission to copy a painting, copy a work of art. So as you walk to the Louvre, you will see people doing this even today, okay? So but there, he did this in 1867 from the balcony of second floor balcony of the Louvre, and in fact, he did three works overlooking the Seine and with the Pantheon in the far distance. It is fall. Notice the trees. And, of course, this is the Rue de Rivoli. This is one of the main streets right here in Paris. And through the trees, we can see the Seine. There is the Seine River right there. And then, of course, we can see over to the left bank. That is the, I want to make sure I get the building correct. Wait a minute. That's the Pantheon in the far distance right there, all right? And notice that the painting is basically half, I would say almost half sky. Mm-hmm. Almost half of it is sky. And here in the front, you can see he has this urban milieu with people walking, and there's three or four coaches. This is obviously an omnibus coach, which would be a public coach, but then there were other coaches, almost like a taxi cab coach, that you could rent out. And there is the small figures of the passers-by, and it looks like a rather busy day in the fall. Now the next one is called the Garden of the Princess, and in the front there is a garden, a very formal English garden, and also painted from the second floor of the Louvre. And the distant building again there is also the Pantheon, right there in the back. Now, through the break, the center shows the street traffic of 5 coaches. Right in the middle here, there's 5 coaches, and there is a mass of people. So in other words, what he's trying to say is this kind of thing, the remaking, the facelift that Paris got from Haussmann is really attracting an awful lot of people. Suddenly, it became fashionable to be walking down the street and to enjoy the parks, which Haussmann had put in, the theaters, the cafes with the sidewalk cafes. Everybody just kind of like, who was in hiding suddenly just came out, and everybody was simply enjoying themselves. Now, if you look very closely at this carpet, this garden right here, it looks to me as if this is almost like floating. And then there is a rail here, and you can see all the traffic in the mid-distance. And then beyond the trees, you can also see the building, the Haussmann buildings. These are the type of buildings that Haussmann approved, and they were built. So you have the foreground with the princesses with the park, and then you have the middle ground here, which is showing all the activity, and then you have the sky. So basically, he's divided the painting into thirds. Now here is another one, which I really like. It's called the Boulevard de Capucines, and the Boulevard de Capucines still has trees planted. Haussmann wanted to bring the trees to the street, you know, and even in New York City, if you go to the east side, there are these lovely trees planted on the street. You don't see that on the west side, and that makes the west side, to my mind, so terribly bleak, because there is absolutely no greenery whatsoever on the west side. But here we have you have this stand of trees right here, and obviously this is wintertime because you can see that the trees have basically lost their leaves. All right, and then you have this huge group of people going in every which direction, and you have coaches going this way and coaches coming this way. But the figures themselves, which were, if you look at the previous work, let's look at this one for a second. You could still pick out the figures the way he painted them. But this is 1867, and by the time we get to 1873, the figures have changed. In fact, they are just little dabs of paint. He suggests them with the little dabs, but he knows that our eye will perceive them as people. Now, when this painting was exhibited at the Impressionist exhibition of 1874, the critics sneered at it, and they called those figures down there black tongue lickings, as if he had licked them onto the canvas. Now, it was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition, which was in 1874, by the way, okay? The Impressionists realized they couldn't get anybody they couldn't get into the salon, so they said, well, let's have our own exhibition, which they did, and every 2 years is when they had the exhibition. Now, the first exhibition, they had no place to do, they had no money, so they couldn't rent a space, and Nadar found out about it. He said, well, you're going to have my studio. Isn't that wonderful? But as I told you, Nadar was a shameless promoter. And of course he knew that it would be written up in the press that Nadar's studio is now exhibiting the work of these young artists, and of course the critics would come and the mobs would come in, the people would come in, and maybe he'd would drum up some business. So in other words, he didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart, let me tell you. Okay, now here, Parkman. At one point, this was a private garden, a private park, but it was acquired by the city in 1860 and became a public park under Haussmann. Now, Monet did 6 paintings of this park, with the people on the benches and the promenaders. Here, there's people on, As you can see, there are a number of ladies on the benches here, and by their uniforms, they are nannies, okay? Again, your costume gave away who you were. So when they saw women like this, they knew that these were baby minders, okay? But I want you to look here. Look at the way he puts the slabs of paint on the canvas right here. Very, very interesting. In other words, his brush stroke has become what we call very loose. Very quick and very loose, all right? And again, we also see the dappled sunlight in the path right here. Notice how the trees kind of come together in an arch. But beyond this, beyond the pathway here and the children and the gentleman sitting here, we can still see figures leaving the park, and beyond that, there is a little tiny suggestion right here of the building across the street. In other words, another example of Haussmann's houses, okay? So he did 6 of these. Now, right now, there is an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum called Public Gardens, Private Parks, I think it is, Public Gardens. It's in the Lehman wing, and this painting is being exhibited there. Now, I suggest that you go, because remember, this picture I have here is a reproduction of a reproduction. So it does not have, you really cannot see the textural quality of the paint or the brushstroke. I can point it out to you, but when you go and see this painting there, you will know what I'm talking about, okay? So this exhibition, I believe, it just started about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I went, as a matter of fact, I went on Palm Sunday because I was really keen on seeing this prior to doing these Impressionist lectures because I wanted to see what they would have there. And so this is one that's in the Metropolitan, and they have it in this special exhibition. And other artists as well, other Impressionists such as Caillebotte, Renoir, Caillebotte, I'm trying to think of some of the others. Oh, also Corot. Corot was not an Impressionist, but he was an older artist who was very successful, a very successful landscapist, and he was the one who encouraged the Impressionists. He was the one who said to Pissarro, "The muse is in the woods, so go and paint in the woods," and that's exactly what Pissarro did. Yeah. Here's another one, done in 1876. Again, we see there's no path here, but we see the trees, beautiful trees, and behind that again, suggestion of an urban landscape and people, a few people in the distance. People in the distance, all right? There's some figures right there, okay? But again, it's a garden, all in bloom. Beautiful, beautiful bush here. I don't know what it is, but it certainly is lovely. Beautiful bush in bloom, beautifully trimmed. And again, a little suggestion. He always puts that little suggestion of something beyond the sky, or in this case, the building, as he did with the previous one. Now, here is the famous Gare Saint-Lazare of 1877. Monet here demonstrates the Impressionist fascination with modern life, which is in keeping with the realistic themes of artists and writers such as Émile Zola. What could be more realistic or more modern than a black train engine puffing and chugging into the Gare Saint-Lazare station? Now, Turner in England painted rushing trains with marvelous atmospheric effects even before the Impressionists. Now, this train pulls into the station with puffs of smoke that look very much like pastel powder puffs, don't they? Yeah. Right. The man is an awestruck onlooker at the scene and not at all alienated. Now, remember this. We look at that and we immediately think of, oh my God, the pollution, oh, that cold smoke, oh my goodness, the acid rain, and oh my word, our lungs don't, we better put a gas mask on. Remember one thing. Industrialization had not yet negatively impacted the environment as it has done in the 20th century and continues to do. Now, by 1977, we were worried about taking the lead out of the gasoline, weren't we? And we were worried about this. We were worried about pure water. We were worried about acid rain and the degradation of our ecology. They weren't worried about this. To them was a marvel. To us, it's a disaster. In 100 years, a marvel becomes a disaster. How can this happen? So, I mean, of course, the fuel then was what? Coal. That was the 19th century source of energy. The 20th century source of energy was oil and natural gas. And the 21st century of energy is going to be solar. So, I mean, imagine how things have changed since this painting was done. I mean, this to my mind is just ties it all together so perfectly. It really does. Now, this station had opened in 1837 and helped usher in the growth of the suburbs to the west and north of Paris. By the 1850s, you could go from Paris to Fontainebleau, which was about 17 miles outside of Paris. There was a beautiful chateau at Fontainebleau that belonged to, I believe it was King Francis I, and he completely redid this beautiful chateau, which you should visit if you go to France. Paris to Fontainebleau took 65 minutes by the train, 8 hours by coach or horse. So there's no comparison. Naturally, the horse and coach and the horse buggy whip went the way of hoop skirts. I mean, it's like saying I'm going to open up a hoop skirt factory right now and employ a lot of people, and maybe I can bring hoop skirts back into fashion. It's impossible. So in other words, as I said, this was a marvel to them, but we look at it and we say, uh-oh, there's problems on the way. Now, this is the Rue Montorgueil in Paris, on Celebration Day of June 30th of 1878. I don't know what the celebration was, but this may have been set up this way for the Bastille Day, which is, July 14th. The row of flags whipping in the breeze decorate the crowded street. Now, the eye is drawn into the center of the composition, almost as if it's a funnel. Our eye is pulled into it, and it's almost as if these two buildings meet here. In fact, it's almost, if you look at it, an X composition, because you have a line running here, and then you have a line of flags running this way, and then you have all this massing of people marching, going down the street and whatnot. It reminds me very, very much of the American Impressionist Childi Hassam and his flag paintings, of which there are a number of them. I know one of them is at the National Gallery, and one of them, unfortunately, was meant to go to the Met, but it never got there. It was owned by Mrs. Astor, Brooke Astor, who died at the age of 107, and she had promised the painting to the Metropolitan. It was a verbal promise. I promise you, you're going to get this painting when I die. She had it hanging above her fireplace. Well, as you well know or can remember, her son Anthony Marshall took the painting, sold it for $2 million, and then took himself a 10% commission, which amounted to $200,000. And upon the basis of that alone, he went to jail, as you know. He and his lawyer went to jail because of they had a new will with a forged signature also, and he also was found of taking money from his mother, which he should not have done. And so in other words, there was quite a brouhaha about this a number of years ago, and Anthony Marshall and his lawyer, Francis Morrissey, went to jail as a result of their shenanigans, and one of them was with that painting, so naturally the Met did not get the painting. They knew that Brooke Astor would give it to them. She said she was a lady of her word, so they were anticipating it, but they never got it. So this is interesting because you find out that sometimes paintings are the life of a painting, which is far longer most of the time than our lives, but the life of a painting can be so terribly interesting. Finding out where it starts and where it begins and where it ends and how did it get from here to there. And I explored this with my class this past spring in the course I did on European museums, and I made a point of talking about that because it's so interesting to find out where it was, where it started, where it went, and how did it get there, okay? But this I find absolutely fascinating, and it pulls you in. In fact, this would be considered a bird's eye view because we're looking down. Now, the Impressionists used this as a compositional device, the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view. On the worm's eye view, you're looking down, you're looking straight up. But in this one, we're looking straight in and down at the crowd walking down the street. Now, I wanted to do a section on portraits. And it occurred to me he did a number of paintings of Camille, and I decided that I was going to do portraits of Camille. And I have to find my notes here. Here it is. Okay. No. Okay. I'm going to show you one that he did of her in 1866 that's a real wow. This is called Camille, or the Lady in the Green Dress. Now, this is an enormous painting. It is 7 feet 7 inches tall and 4 feet 11 inches wide, so you can imagine how large it is. It first hung in the first gallery on the entering the Metropolitan Museum show, Fashion, Impressionism and Modernity in 2012, and it is a knock-em-dead work done before Monet embraced Impressionism. He was still, this is 1866, remember, he had not yet totally embraced Impressionism. He was working toward that, all right? Camille was 19 and an artist model. The work was supposedly completed in 4 days and was submitted to the Salon of 1866, where it received rave reviews. Now, when I read this 4 days, I said, wait a minute, the painting would have had to have been hung and still probably be wet, you know, because it takes oil painting quite a time to dry. You do one coat, you let it dry, and then the next day the artist says, well, I have to do my second coat, and does that, and then of course there's maybe a third coat, and then there's the varnishing and everything else. So I find it hard to believe that it couldn't be done in 4 days, and if they did, they probably had to hang it up while it was still damp, okay? Now, as you know, the Salon opens every year, May 1st of every year, and he received quite a bit of press in this. She's dressed as a fashionable Parisian in the latest fashion, of course. The shimmery highlights of the train with the folds and the sweep come down across as a challenge, as if Monet throws the gauntlet down and dares anyone to question his ability as an artist. You have this wonderful, if you start at the top, this wonderful, start right here, sweep all the way down. A strong curved diagonal, and of course he paints her against a black background to have her figure stand out, and it really is truly a knockout piece. Camille is almost, as a matter of fact, she's almost lost in all this glory of fur and fabric, and she was pregnant at the time and had the baby. The baby was born in August of August. I think it was, no, the baby was born. She may have been in the early stages of pregnancy because the baby was born in August of 1867. And believe it or not, she was alone because Monet had abandoned her and gone back to Honfleur because his father had cut off the allowance when he found out that Camille was pregnant. Okay? So Monet is begging money from Bastille for some money. Frederick Bastille was very wealthy. Now, the painting was sold, fortunately, for 800 francs to Arsène Houssaye, who was a director of the art journal L'Artiste. Fashion portraits such as these now emulated the fashion plates found in magazines of the time, such as Godey's Lady's Book. Now, the Impressionists, and especially Monet, got many of his inspirations from the lithographs that appeared in these magazines. They also, now Godey's Lady's Book was an American magazine, so was Peterson's magazine. But I'm going to show you a lithograph from a Peterson lithograph from the magazine. In 1875, a little later than what we were talking of, than Camille's dress. But as you can see, it's the same thing with the dresses. These women are in a. It looks like they're in a drawing room, okay, and each one's showing off their dress. Now, these lithographs initially, before the 1880s, these lithographs were done just in black and white, okay, and they were put in the magazine. But if you wanted it colored, they had women who acted as colorists and would paint in the colors of the dress the way the publisher wanted it painted. No doubt they were earning probably a pittance, maybe maybe a nickel or 2 or 3 cents for painting one of these things. But by the 1880s, the technique of color lithography had been mastered, but they would use many plates. For example, they would do the initial black and white, and then the lady with the blue dress, they would have another plate, colored blue, and they would pull that, and the lady's blue dress would be colored. Then the lady in the green dress would be colored. So in other words, to do this would require maybe 8 or 9 plates, maybe 10 plates, so that you could get a full color lithography of this. Now, this was done in 1875, and I dare say it was probably done colored in by hand, okay? So you can see where he got his inspiration. Now, these fashion books were really, really hot. I mean, this was like, getting the latest issue of, People magazine. But women they really went nutsy for the fashions, and of course it was just so wonderful to have this book in your hand and be able to look at the latest clothing and go to your dressmaker and say, well, can you make me a dress that looks like that? And the dressmaker would say, oh, sure I can. And they had patterns, because the pattern manufacturers manufactured patterns according to these designs, because they would make money, you see. And the seamstresses would make money as well, because all these clothes were hand sewn. No, by this time there may have been some machines, but the finishing work may very well have been done by hand. I think by that time Singer machines were becoming quite common. Now here is again Camille under a lilac tree. Now the hat that she is wearing, which looks kind of like a little bonnet and tied under the chin, was very fashionable at the time, as was a hat that looked like a flower pot that sat on your head. But this is the kind of thing they wore in the summertime. Now a show has just closed in San Francisco. I didn't know about it until after it closed, called Degas, Impressionism and Millinery. And the exhibit focused just on hats. Not only women's hats, but men's hats as well. Because as we've talked about the fact that no gentleman would go out without his top hat. And if he were going to business, well, he might decide to use his bowler. But in other words, you would not dream of leaving your house without a hat if you were of a certain class. Now, most poor women couldn't afford hats. They'd probably put a little scarf or a little shawl on their head. But if you had any pretensions to middle class, you wore the latest hat. And with ladies, it was, some of these hats went crazy. I mean, you know, the big shapes and flowers and silk and feathers and everything else on the hat. So here she is seated in a garden, and she herself looks like a flower with the dress completely enveloping her, and she's reading. Now, a Camille under the lilac tree, and here you can see some of the little field flowers have been spread on her dress, all right? And there she sits, very placidly. The hat is gorgeous, it really is, but that was a very fashionable hat in the 1870s, extremely fashionable. Now here's another one. Here is Camille and child. We don't know who the child is, and by the way, the child is a boy. Now, when I did this lecture recently, I said, well, there's a little wooden horse there, but she's wearing a pink bow, and I was suddenly, one of my beliefs was shattered by one of my students who told me that until the 1940s, pink was a color for boys, and she had something on her cell phone, and she showed me the article. So now I stand corrected. Now, that is a little boy. Now, they did dress little boys in dresses in those days, but when I saw the pink bow, I said, well, it had to be a girl. No, it's a boy. Plus, as you can see, he's playing with a little toy horse over there, okay? And there is Camille sewing. Notice how, now, in the background, you have this massing of flowers, every conceivable color. As a matter of fact, Monet once said, I became an artist because of flowers. That's how much he loved gardening and flowers, and that's the reason why he became an artist, she said. Now, there she is seated in the garden. Again, it's the summertime, this massing of flowers, which act as a wall, setting her off from anything that's behind. And notice that she is wearing a blue striped dress, and so is the little boy seated on the pathway there. It's a very calm, serene scene of a woman with a small child, both enjoying themselves in their own way, and she's heartily at work doing a little bit of needlework as she minds the baby. But it is just such a beautiful work, and again, nobody could paint flowers like that. I swear to goodness, it's just marvelous. Mm-hmm. Now here is another picture of her, known as La Japonaise. Now, there was great interest in Japanese art and all things Japanese in the 1870s. It was all the rage, and it was called in French Japonism, Japaneseism, all right? The Impressionists were especially taken with Japanese composition, and because the engravings and the drawings of Utamaro and other Japanese artists began to arrive in France, and they were fascinated with the negation of space and the perspective, which is not the kind of Western perspective that we are used to, and also with the figures, the costumes, the emphasis upon the gardens, and which, of course, the Impressionists were very much in love with, and so that all of these things came together, and it became fashionable to have something Japanese in your home, whether it was a Japanese shawl decorating your piano, or whether it was a Japanese screen, that you would have a screen in the room, you know, defining, let's say, a part of the room, or a Japanese print on the wall. It was very, very in other words, it was the latest thing in decoration, shall we say. Now, here Camille is wearing a blonde wig because he wants to emphasize that she is Occidental, not Oriental. And she wears an elaborate kimono. I don't know where he got this, embroidered with a samurai warrior on it. This must have been extremely expensive and probably very, very hard to find as well. Now, notice the way he has her posed. She turns toward us, and we have this lovely sweep of the sleeve here, and then you have the lovely sweep of the fan she is holding. That echoes the sweep of the dress right here. The dress here is shaped very much as the fan is shaped, is it not? Then we also see fans on the floor, all right? In other words, just casual placement of these fans. But behind her on the wall is all sorts of Japanese fans have been placed. Now, this painting also is extremely large. It's 91 inches by 56 inches wide, and it was shown at the Impressionist Show of 1876, where it was a showstopper, not only because of the painting, but also because of the subject matter. He immediately embraced the Japonism of the 1870s. This painting, by the way, is in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts and is really worthwhile going to see. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is not too pleasant. This is Camille on her deathbed in 1879. As I told you, the little boy had been born in 1878, and by this 1879, she was basically bedridden, all right, with this cervical ulcer that was cancerous. Monet took on the responsibility of the Hochedet family, and they lived together in Verthoy, where she was cared for by Alice and Alice's daughters. She died in 1879, and this was obviously done just before she died. Monet paints her as if she's being swallowed up by the bedclothes. You see a face, you don't see anything else, and it's as if she's slowly sinking into the bedclothes, and the pillow around her, and she's wearing a scarf on her head, so that she's slowly sinking away. And she's no longer of this life. In other words, shall we say, the path she is taking, he cannot go with her. And she is slowly fading away from him. And you can see, look at the brushstroke, look at how loose it has become. Now, it was, I don't want to use the word fashionable, but it was common in the 19th century to take a photograph of a dead person, a child, because many children died, as we know. Even infants, they would take a picture of an infant lying in the coffin. Death called at their homes much more frequently than they call at ours, because we have managed to control certain diseases and whatnot, so that we all are living very long lives. Now, we might think it a bit ghoulish to have pictures of someone in the coffin, and sometimes family members standing there or whatever. But this was fashionable even before. With lithographs, they would have a daguerreotype done of the person who had died, and in some cases, I've even read that the dead person was placed on a chair and was photographed that way, which would be kind of ghoulish to us and kind of unpleasant. But this was the way they did it, and we look upon it differently. Attitudes have changed, let's put it that way. Attitudes have definitely changed. But that was common then, and this was his way of dealing with his wife's death. But I wanted to put this in because I wanted you to see basically a range of portraits of her. But this, as unpleasant as it is, shows it's done marvelously. It truly was. The way she is just sinking into the bedclothes, and her spirit is going away. All right, now let's look at the Suburban Scenes. Now, I'm showing you the suburbs of Paris. This map is going to be important because I'm going to be talking about a lot of the villages outside of Paris. Now, here, there is Paris, and these were the little villages that were outside. Now, some of these have almost been subsumed by Paris, okay? I'm going to show you a picture in a moment. Now, today you can take, for example, from Paris, you can take an underground, a subway, to Versailles, Ville d'Avray, which is right here. Wait a minute, I'll try to get this here to point there, right there. Or Sèvres, where all the porcelain is done. Bougival, we're going to be talking about Bougival in a few minutes, okay? Louveciennes on Marly-le-Roi. Here is where Alexandre Dumas had the house that he built that I showed you the picture of in the first lecture. Here's Chatou. We're going to be talking about Chatou in a few minutes also. Croissy, also Croissy. Let me see. Pontoise. This is where Pissarro lived because he had a large family and he couldn't live in Paris. It was too expensive. So he lived at this this village that was far outside of Paris called Pontoise, okay? This is where he lived. Argenteuil. Well, Monet lived there for a while as well. And you see the way the Seine meanders here. By the way, the Seine is navigable up until Rouen, which is outside of Paris. I was once on small cruise ships can come up, not the large ones, like, the ones that hold 3,000 people. You can't navigate it. But if you're in a small cruise ship, you can navigate as far as Rouen. And from there, you get on a bus or a train or whatever, and then get yourself to Paris in about an hour and a half. So you can see how the Seine meanders. Oh dear, keeps on meandering and kind of like does a lot of switchbacks. Okay, now you see what the Ville d'Avray is right here. You see that right there. Now this is my picture that I took from Ville d'Avray looking toward Paris. So you can see how close Paris is to Ville d'Avray. It's still considered a separate village because the address was Ville d'Avray, but you can see how close it is. There's a hill in Ville d'Avray, and I was taken to the hill and I was able to take this picture. And there, of course, is the Eiffel Tower, and this is the outskirts of Paris, but you can clearly see the Eiffel Tower there. So these villages are very close. And the next one after Ville d'Avray would be Sèvres, where where the famous porcelains that were done in the 18th century came from. Okay, let's start now. Let's look at this. La Grenouille from 1869. This bathing place was on the island of Croissy in the Seine. Now let's go back for a minute and I'll show you Croissy. Wait a minute. Croissy. You see that right there? Right there, where the river bends, that was Croissy. Okay, that's what we're looking at now. We're going to be looking at Croissy. Now, the Grenouillère was a little place where the tourists would come every weekend. And this was actually a bathing place, and you can see there are some bathers bobbing around in the water. Well, I mean, this was something novel, to suddenly go and start splashing around in the water. They didn't actually go swimming. They just simply splashed around. But it was the latest thing to do, you see. Now, in the center of this is the Seine River. In the center of the Seine, there was this little tiny, what looks like a little island called the Camembert, because it was shaped like the Camembert cheese. Then, needless to say, the French called it after something to eat, because they're with their cuisine. Naturally, that's a piece of cheese. It's not an island; it's a piece of cheese. Now, there were two little footbridges, one over here, as you can see, that went to the island, and one over there. Now, he went to this place with Renoir. Monet is seated on the left. Renoir is seated on the right. They always did it that way, okay? And they would paint the same scene. And then, no doubt, they would sit afterward and they would say, well, now, why did you do this? And I did this. Oh, why did you do that with the trees there in the background? And they would critique, and in other words, they fed off each other. There was nobody else they could talk to. They couldn't go to somebody at the salon and compare notes, but they compared notes with each other, and thus they learned from each other, and this is the way they developed their art. Now, not only that, when they were in Paris, they would go to a particular cafe, which is today on the Rue de Clichy. I think it may be there, called the Café Gerbois, where they would meet twice a week. not only the artists, but also the writers who supported them, like Zola, Astruc, Georges Rivière, perhaps Theodore Doré, etc. They would all meet there, and they would discuss and talk about art and the cultural scene, shall we say. And the only ones who couldn't go there were the two women impressionists, mainly Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot. I mean, it was improper for a woman to go like that and sit with men, strange men, in a cafe. But it was a meeting place for them, and not only that, it was a place where they could all get together and talk about what they were doing and how things were going, etc. And Degas also was a member of this group as well. And it went on for a number of years that they did this. This was not just a sometime thing. They would there would always be 8 or 9 of them sitting at a table, and it's unfortunate that a recording could not have been made, or any kind of narrative existing about what actually was talked about at 1 or 2 of these sessions. But many of these artists, as they became famous and were interviewed, would talk about their times at being at the Café Gerbois. Now, so this is Monet's picture. Now, there was also a little restaurant right here. Okay. Now, notice that Monet paints all the boats pointing inward to pull our eye into the little camembert here. Notice the way he does the water. We've seen those slabs of paint before, haven't we? Sure, we have with the Parkman. And in the background, he has a stand of trees. And it may be late summer because the trees are yellow, but of course it just could have been the sun on the trees, and he just decided to paint them that color. But the stand of trees, and then of course we see part of the little restaurant right here, and of course we see another overhanging tree with the branches coming down, and the bathers bobbing up and down in the water. Now, sitting next to him on the right is Renoir, and this is Renoir. Now, we're not going to talk about Renoir until next September, but I wanted to show you the comparison. So that's the reason why I'm talking about Renoir now, because I want to show you some of this collaboration between the two of them. Now, there's Renoir's picture. Renoir is on the right. As you can see, the footbridge is a little bit extends beyond the picture. He's cut it off right there, but there are people bobbing around again. But he spends most of his time with the camembert, all right? And there's a boat that's docked right by the camembert, and here's the other boats, but there's one, and there's another footbridge right here, and he catches just the edge of the little casino here with a sign on it that I can't read, unfortunately. And here are figures walking across this footbridge, and there is a boat in the background. There is a boat there, there's a boat there. Now, at this point, too, he began using little touches of red or little touches of orange to attract your eye in. And you can see that he used some orange over there, a little bit over there, a little bit of orange over here, okay? And he began using these touches, and there's a little suggestion of it right there. There's another boat coming this way, you see, because this was a place for boaters, boating, rowboats, and also sculls, with sculls with the rowers on both sides. So, and again, it's a fashionably dressed crowd because they came from the train station and they chugged along there, and then they got off, and then they took possibly an omnibus to this place, and it was a very, very popular place and very, very well known. So, now I'm going to show you another collaboration. This is a sailboats at Argenteuil, and we talked about Argenteuil, okay? By the way, the isle is called the Ile de Croissy, okay? And the Ile de Croissy, and he focused more yet. Camembert or Ile de Croissy, and he focused more on the revelers, and as we can see, the boats here occupy less space than in Manet's work. Now let's look at the sailboats at Argenteuil. This is another collaboration. The scene was another collaborative work with Renoir sitting on his right and Monet sitting on the left, okay, they always occupied their spaces that way. We see two figures on a sailboat, which is unusual for Monet because, for Monet, because he usually shows the boats moored. But here we see a little footbridge, a little pier, pier right here, or footbridge that leads out to the sailboat, and these gentlemen look like they're getting ready to sail off, and he's even managed to capture the little ducks in the water. And of course, look at the wonderful reflection that he has. Additionally, he has put two sailboat, well, not scullers, they call that a scull, scullers boats right here, and another one here. And in this corner, that is the place where you paid the toll. That's the toll house over there, okay? So, and of course we can still see the opposite side of the river. Now, let's look at Renoir's. Now you can see Renoir has cut off the sail. He's off to the side, and the ducks are there. But this man is still standing on the footbridge. He has not yet gone into the sailboat. And here is another sailboat which is not in sail because the sails have been rolled up. And there are other boats here, and there, and he shows here behind this stand of trees a house. Now, I don't believe that is the toll house. No, it's not the toll house. It's a house that's been, perhaps the way Renoir was sitting, the way Monet was sitting, the sail would have blocked that house. The sail would have blocked it. So now, but with Renoir, we see the house, okay? And we also see the suggestion of a bridge. You see the bridge right there? There is a bridge going by, okay? There is a bridge which crosses the river, and that is probably the reason that the toll house is right there, because they probably still, you had to pay, let's say, a penny toll or something to go across the bridge. Now, most of these tolls were eliminated in Paris by housemen, because when you eliminate tolls, you encourage commerce. The farmers bringing their things in and people taking things out and whatnot, it encourages commerce, okay? And that's important. It was important for the lifeblood of the city, but it also, Paris began growing exponentially because people didn't have to live in Paris. Suddenly they could live outside of town and still get to Paris whenever they had to for work or whatever. Now here is another one called the Bridge at Bougival. Now this bridge, Bougival, this is seen early in the morning as the locals are crossing into Bougival. Croissy Island would be behind us, okay? Bougival is a little further out than Croissy. Now, we know these are locals, and how do we know it? Because look at the way she's dressed. She's dressed as a simple peasant lady with a little hat on her head. The little boy wearing a little smock. The little boy wearing a little smock right here. Now, this stand of trees and these figures right here are the exact center of the painting. And if you look at the way the topography falls here, right there is where the two lines meet, right in that stand of trees. That is the dead center of the painting. And of course, he paints the lady walking up across the bridge because he wants us to move our eye into the painting. So you have basically a crossing, and then you have this vertical right here, this very strong vertical, which again pulls our eyes in. Notice the shadows. Notice the shadows on the pathway. There are also 2 or 3 figures here conversing, and there is a small barge right here, and again this path is completely in shadow. It's a grayish, but these are again the lavender shadows for which she is so justly famous, because, and then of course the clouds there. So basically the painting is half sky and half the village, all right? But it is morning. It is morning, and early morning. You don't have. And besides, it's a little village. There isn't going to be a mob of people there. It's going to be just people who are locals who go out to on errands or whatever, to perhaps go to a store or go to a little shop for something they need, and And obviously, it's a very quiet village. We see houses here, and notice how beautifully how he does the houses. As this piece of topography here falls, so do the houses fall. You see one house there, one there, one there, and one there, you see? And you have a lovely stand of, again, some more trees here which are flowering. So we know it's summertime because, of course, they're not wearing heavy clothing at all. But I just love this one. I really do. Anyway, now we're back to a garden again. Now this is women in the garden. This canvas was so huge that Monet had to dig a trench to lower the canvas so that he could get to the top to paint it. He always did these huge paintings. He was, in other words, it was like, let me catch your attention as quickly as I can. Now, he paints three women in all the glories of French fashion in the 1860s, okay? Camille poses under the tree. She's right here. And notice the scalloped embroidery of her dress, which is beautifully done, by the way. And notice also the parasol has the same kinds of scallops on it, all right? And the parasol shades her face, and you notice here how the shadowing right here, and then the dress, this brilliant, dazzling white. And she also poses here with a bouquet in front of her face. And now there is another land. Now notice this. There is a path which leads this way, and there is a woman who is walking up the path, and she looks as if she's walking very fast, doesn't she? Like she's walked up that path, and she's walking very, very quickly. Now notice the tree. The tree divides the painting exactly in half, but the branches of the tree embrace both groups of these three women and that woman, so it unifies the painting. And of course, now here's another backward-facing figure, because of course, with black and white, but black scallops, she also has black scallops on her dress. Her dress is very similar to hers, okay? And again, he exploits the decoration on the clothes in order to unify the painting. As I mentioned, with the parasol and the scallops on the dress, you also see that the scallops here, and you see the same thing here with the scallops. But again, this was at the exhibition in the Metropolitan in 2012, and these scallops were so beautifully done. It was like he had actually embroidered it on the canvas. That's how beautifully it was done. Now this is another one of those, shall we say, funnel views that pull you in. And as a matter of fact, this is not a bird's eye view. This would be a worm's eye view, as if you are at the very bottom of that garden path and you are looking up and you see all these sunflowers converging toward the top. And meanwhile, the little boy, his son, which would be Jean right here, who would have been about... this would probably be the younger boy, about two and a half years old here, with a little cart right here, obviously one of his little toys, okay? And of course the garden path becomes the steps to the house, which we see in the background. And this is when they were living at Bethoi in 1881 with the Hochaday family. And of course, Camille had already died in 1879. But again, it's a typical Impressionist composition, the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view, and you were looking up into it. Now I'm going to show you another one of these views. Now this is another one, corner of an apartment in 1875. Again, it's got that funnel look to it, but what he does, he has two potted palms here. Two potted palms, which kind of, shall we say, frame the painting. And there are also additional plants on the floor. You see there's one right there, and there's one on this side as well. And then the texture of the floor, the texture of the foliage becomes the texture of the floor, if you notice. Mm-hmm. And there is the little boy standing in the very center of the painting, and behind him there is a table with a lady seated, and behind that, above that, there is a chandelier. And notice that the curtains are drawn back very much the way the plant echoing the shape of the plant. So it's all very, very well, shall we say, thought out, very, very well composed. And he knew what he was doing, okay? But again, we have the worm's eye view. We are looking up at, and then of course beyond the chandelier and the window, we can see that there is a railing. Probably there might be some grill work on the window that he suggests right here, as you can see. Very interesting, I thought, and that's the reason why I put that in here. I wanted that to be shown. Now here is one called The Luncheon from 1874. This is a painting he did, and he called it Decorative Panel. This was one of the paintings that he was going to do for the Rocheday mansion. Remember I mentioned he was going to do 4 paintings for them? Well, of course they had a mansion, so this had to be a big painting. It isn't a small one, it had to be large, because it was going to cover one whole wall of the room. And he painted it in 1876, and he called it Decorative Panel. It is another view of his garden at Argenteuil, the house, which is one, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing here. Wait a minute. Yeah. Oh, yeah, 74. It's one block, this was his garden at Argenteuil, 1 block from the railway station, and this was going to be put into the Rocheday's home. It's a very large work occupying a wall. We see the remains of a meal. There is in the foreground, there is a remains of a meal and a still life right here. We know people have been here, for example, and there is a parasol here. There is a tote bag right here. So we know that there is a visitor at the house, because there is the lady of the house, Camille, walking with another lady, and he's even hung a hat on the branch of the tree, just as a kind of, well, what do you do with the hat? If you're not going to wear it, you hang it on the tree so it's handy when you need it. But meanwhile, he also places some other homey touches. There is his little boy sitting on the ground, very patiently playing with his toy, totally engrossed in what he's doing, and he places this beautiful still life here, all right, as evidence that someone has been there. The tablecloth is a little wrinkled. There is also a serving basket right here. So in other words, it indicates there are people there, but the people have walked away, which is very much a Dutch device in painting, and especially in still life painting. And then again, this massing of flowers right here. He always put masses of flowers together. And here, and here. And of course, there's a bench where they were having tea. You can see there is remains of tea, 2 teacups, all right, and the visitor, she was entertaining the lady in the garden with the tea. And this was one of the pictures that was meant for the Rocheday home in 1876. Now here is another one, Terrace at Saint-Adresse from 1867. Monet, as we know, embraced the seaside theme of Eugene Boudin. But it's important to remember that going to the beach was a very new and novel idea, okay, in the 19th century. Today, it's nothing. Everybody's, pretty soon, the New Jersey Parkway is going to become a parking lot. Will it not? In June and July, it becomes a parking lot, sure, because everybody goes down to the shore on a Friday or Saturday, and then Sunday, the parking lot is on the opposite side coming north. So we don't think anything of this. Everybody does it. But in those days, it was really quite the thing to do, and very new and very novel. And most of the people who did this were middle class, because of course they could afford the amount of money to take the train rides. Now this would be at a terrace at Saint-Adresse, which is right on the Atlantic Ocean. Thus it appealed to the Impressionists. It's a contemporary theme, and this composition now is another one of the type of compositions that the Impressionists used. It's called the horizontal strip composition. 1/3 of the painting, well, just a little bit less than 1/3 of the painting, is sky, as you can see, and probably toward the end of the day, not morning. I'm pretty sure the sun is setting here. The center part of it is water, And the bottom part, the third part, is the garden overlooking the water. What unites the composition is these two flag poles right here with the red and white flag and the red, white, and blue flag, the tricolore, and echoed by all the hollyhocks in the garden. So you have a unity of composition, a unity of color, but you also have, now here we have put a sailboat right here, okay? Right here, a sailboat in the water. But you also have a very, very contemporary note of a number of steam packets that are plying along right on the horizon, obviously taking people from Dover in England over to one of the ports in France. So, and these are steam packets. Notice the smoke coming out. So he uses the new method of transporting people is now a steam packet, no longer a large sailboat or whatever. It's a steam packet, and it goes, of course, they go much quicker, and from Dover to France. So in other words, he puts this contemporary note there to remind us that this is a modern work, not an old-fashioned one. Now, the people, by the way, the people seated here are his aunt and uncle, and I believe this was their home in San Andres, because he came from a rather well-off family. But notice that the ladies have their parasols. This man is wearing a bowler hat, but this man is wearing a straw hat, and it did become fashionable for men to wear straw hats like that if they were going out to the country or to the beach. And we will see that with, let's say, when we see Renoir's the luncheon of the boating party, we will see straw hats like that. Okay. Now, here is one of his paintings called Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This is a 6-foot sketch. This is not the actual painting. A 6-foot sketch that he did. Now, all artists did sketches, but they would primarily do small sketches. They'd have some ideas, they put the ideas down, and they maybe do another sketch and a third sketch, and they begin comparing which would be a better composition. But this sketch is an actual oil sketch that's 6 feet across. And it is a picture of a painting that Monet never finished, and as a matter of fact, he cut the picture into 2 pieces. So, and in 2012 at the Met, the 2 pieces were united, and they were like 9 feet. They were phenomenally huge. They really were. Now, unlike Manet's Déjeuner, Monet is not mocking his onlookers. A Parisian middle-class group, judged by their clothing, are partaking of a repast in a park. They sit there casually on the ground with the dog. There's a dog there eyeing the food while a lady adjusts her bonnet. There's one right there adjusting her bonnet. And the lady that's serving, now I'm going to show you another one here. This is the fragment, and I took this from the Musée d'Orsay. It's because many times I have a great deal of difficulty finding a picture that is clear and that also is true to the color. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'll find a picture, and when I attempt to blow it up, it fuzzes out and I can't use it. So I am constantly looking for pictures. And as a matter of fact, I did a revision of this series of lectures, and I was looking for pictures, and this is the closest I could find to what it really looks like. Now, there is Camille. Camille is setting the table, not a table, but setting the dishes out on the tablecloth, which has been put on the ground. There are 2 people who have just arrived. Again, they are wearing country clothing, and if we look back at this, we see one of the gentlemen has taken off his jacket and is leaning back on his elbows. These casual poses became quite common with the Impressionists. Now, do you remember the picture I showed you of Monet? He was sitting of Renoir sitting on a chair with his legs up. Now, that was a very, very unusual pose in those days, because if you were posing for a portrait, you would sit very stiffly. Mm-hmm. But here he is, he has his legs up on the end, and he's resting his elbows on his knees. So this was this casual look, this very, very caught in the moment look. And this too, this man here lying, just lying on the grass. okay, and just relaxing under the trees. Again, notice the dresses. Look at this one right here. Really, really, really. You can tell these are people from the city because of the clothes they are wearing. And I really wonder what women did with their dresses dragging in the grass like that. It really must have been, really got kind of messy, I suppose. But they must have had some kind of a lining in the bottom underneath. They had to, because the dresses would get dirty and they would have to maybe change the lining underneath. But I can't imagine walking down a city street with that. Okay. All right, now let's look at this. Now we also know that Monet would become fascinated with something, such as the Rouen Cathedral or haystacks, and he would sit down and he would start painting. And many of them were obsessed with things. For example, Degas was obsessed with laundresses and ballet dancers and horse races. And he would do women bathing themselves. He must have done at least 100 paintings of women bathing themselves until he either got tired of it or thought he had exhausted every permutation he could find of a woman bathing or a woman ironing a shirt, okay? And as a matter of fact, one day somebody went to his studio and came back and said to Fred, "Oh, his studio, laundresses, nothing but laundresses," because but he was obsessive that way, and so in a way was Monet, because he decided to paint the Rouen Cathedral, and he would go there with a number of canvases, as you probably know, and he would start painting, and when he sensed that the light had changed, he would put that canvas down, pick up another one, and start painting on that one. And then when the light would change, he'd pick up the third canvas. So in other words, he'd be walking around with all these wet canvases, and he would do the changes of the facade of the Rouen Cathedral, which of course is a Gothic cathedral. And Gothic cathedrals have many, many small little niches and filigree and whatnot, so that the light that goes across it has so many different permutations that it is really fascinating to see. Now, the church is still there, and of course everybody goes to Rouen to see the church, because that's where Monet worked. But anyway, when you see them together, it is really wonderful to see. When you can, let's say, see 5 or 6 of them. Now, most museums maybe have 1, maybe have 2, but sometimes they have a show, and I'm sure the architectural show that's right now in London are going to have a lot of these, okay? Because it's all Monet painting architecture. And they're going to have lots of these, so you'll be able to make those comparisons very, very easily when you see one after the other, okay? And notice, too, how very, very abstract his work has become. We know it's the Rouen Cathedral, and we could tell that it's a church with 2 towers, but, I mean, you really have to... You'd have to know that was Rouen Cathedral, and Monet did all those church paintings. Otherwise, you'd look at it and say, well, oh yeah, it's a building of some sort. But what gives it away, of course, is the rose window there in the middle and these 2 towers on either side. Okay, let's look at another. Now, this is his garden at Giverny. This was done in 1902, and as you can see, again, he's got the funnel effect of pulling you in up 2 paths, which are just with all this vegetation on either side, looking very, very much like azaleas or something of that. Look like azaleas or rhododendrons, don't they? Sure, on either side, because those colors are quite common with those flowers. And of course, at the very end, there looks to be some steps right there, but notice the dappling, how he dapples those shadows, and the shadows, light, shadows, light, shadows, light. Does that to pull our eye in. Does that. He wants your eye to move, and that's the way to get it to move, you see. He can't have it all in the dappled shadow. He's got to have a contrast with that. Now, this is the Japanese bridge. He did many paintings of this, and I put this one in there because this one is at the Princeton Museum of Fine Arts. You can go there. It's free to get in. They're wonderful, very, very lovely museum, and this particular painting is there. As a matter of fact, once I was on a trip, and I think it was to London, and this painting was at an exhibition. It's because it's lent out, because it's so famous, this the bridge at Giverny. And this is the bridge that goes over the pond that he had built, and this is like the house that Jack built, you know. This is the bridge that's over the pond that has the flowers that Monet built, okay? Now, I'm going to show you in a few minutes another one of these, the same view of the Japanese bridge. Whoops, wait a minute. Here it is. Now, this is the water lilies from 1906. And you realize that toward the end of his life, he was getting cataracts. And the cataracts were operated on, which was a very dangerous operation in those days, I would imagine. Today, it's really quite nothing. But in those days, it was very, very a dangerous and serious, very, very serious operation. Now, this is the Japanese bridge in 1918 to 1924, totally abstracted. You can barely make it out, and it's just this green and blue permutations of so many tonalities, so many intensities or of color, but that's the Japanese bridge. And I wanted to show that to you because, again, how his hand developed, how his artistic development occurred. Now, I'm going to show you, yes, I'm going to show you this. Marianne, why are you suddenly going back to the 1880s and showing us this? Because at the current exhibition at the Metropolitan, they have 3 paintings of chrysanthemums. I did not know that chrysanthemums were that popular in the 1870s, 1880s, because they had been brought from China, and I didn't know that they had been brought from China. I know they used them in Chinese pictures, but I didn't realize that they had been brought from China and were considered a very unusual flower, just as when orchids were introduced in Europe in the 1820s, 1830s, okay? Now, this one, which is at the Met, there's 3 of them, all in a row. Monet, Caillebotte, and Renoir. They are all, no, Renoir is first, I'm sorry, Renoir, Caillebotte, and then Monet. And they are all pictures of chrysanthemums. Now, the picture looks almost as if there is a piece of glass on the table, but there isn't. It's just the shine of the table. But my picture cannot show. You have this beautiful massing of flowers in the blue vase, and one of the flowers has fallen out of the vase. But you see the lovely reflections on the polished surface of the table. What my picture cannot show to you is the entire painting vibrates. It has a wonderful vibration in it because the flowers look almost like they are moving. And it is absolutely marvelous painting. And I appended this deliberately to my lecture, because I wanted to show you, I wanted to introduce this to you so you would go there to see this. It is absolutely marvelous. My reproduction cannot at all reproduce the textures, the various, brush strokes, the way he mixed the paint. He would put 2 colors on the brush and then just make one stroke with 2 colors, maybe a pink and a white or a blue and a white. And this reproduction can't show it. You've got to go there and look at it with your own eyes. And I certainly hope you do. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you.